What's up, Eichmann's Angels? I'm going to do my best ninja nerd impression today, and I'm going to try and talk to you about what lactic acidosis is, how we get it, what our body's response to it is, and then also interpreting Jenny's ABGs a little bit. So first let's talk about the anion gap, because we were a little confused about it in PCL. So basically what it is, I think we all get this basic concept, but I'm going to talk about it anyway, is the summation of the positively charged ions from the negatively charged ions. So we have sodium and potassium added together, and then you subtract chloride and bicarb. Some places won't add potassium in the calculation of the anion gap because it's kind of a small value, but I figured I'd throw it in for our purposes today. And so normally your anion gap should be 0 in your body, like physiologically, but when we calculate it, we're kind of given this reference value of a normal range of 3 to 10 MEQs. And that's because what we're calculating here doesn't actually include all of the negatively charged things inside of our blood serum. So a normal gap should be pretty small, and the things that account for that small gap are ketones, phosphates, and lactate. So if you have a really big gap, you have way more lactate or ketones or something else that is indicative of acidosis. And we kind of know from Jenny's case that lactate's what accounting for this big gap. And having a big anion gap is also indicative of metabolic acidosis compared to respiratory acidosis. So how do we get too much lactate? Well, we have, this is kind of the chemical reaction of the breakdown of pyruvate and NADH and hydrogen to lactate. And if this reaction gets shifted over to the right, either by too much pyruvate or too much NADH, then we get, too much lactate. And these things are caused by something like cardiogenic shock, which our patient is experiencing, sepsis, or acute hypoxia. And when we have lactic acidosis, our body has a couple of ways of compensating for that. So the first thing that we'll do is respiratory compensation. We've talked about this in block 1 with diabetic ketoacidosis. It's called Kussmaul breathing. Your body just increases the amount of ventilation that it's doing to try and excrete as much CO2, because CO2 in our blood is acidic, and so we want to try and get rid of whatever acidic material we can to raise our pH. And then there's also renal compensation, which Dr. Eichmann touched on very briefly, but what it is our kidney will actively try and take up bicarb, or no, your kidneys will try to put out bicarb to try and add more negatively charged things to our anion gap here, and it'll do that by kind of trading off a hydrogen within the tubules. Our kidneys are able to catalyze this reaction, the breakdown of CO2 and water to bicarb and hydrogen because of this enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. So we know that Jenny's body is trying to compensate for this acidosis that she's in, but her pH is still really low. So whatever she's doing to try and compensate internally isn't working. And how we look at these ABGs to help us determine whether it's respiratory or metabolic or both is we want to look at the partial pressure in the blood caused by CO2, because the more pressure that's in the blood caused by CO2 is kind of indicative of more CO2 in the blood in general. So there's, if it is high, then we know that it's indicative of respiratory acidosis. And then the partial pressure of oxygen is kind of more of an indicative of like respiratory distress in general, less helpful in determining if it's respiratory or metabolic. And then there's also the milli equivalence of bicarbonate in the blood. And so if that's really low, we don't have enough anions to add to our anion gap, so we're going to have a big base deficit or not enough negatively charged things to contribute to our anion gap. So we're going to know that because this is the amount of bicarb in the blood is controlled by the kidneys, it's a metabolic acidosis. So we have a big base deficit because we don't have enough negatively charged anions to close our gap. And then it's also respiratory because there's the CO2 is out of range. So it's like we talked about in the case, it's kind of a double whammy of acidosis caused by respiratory and metabolic distress. And then this lactate I thought was kind of interesting because it just confirms that that's what is contributing to our unknown negatively charged things in our anion gap. So I think that should cover what the LOI that I was assigned was. If you have any questions about it, find me in class or email me.